Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Dear listeners, welcome back. I'm Tim Sayward, and I'm joined here by some bloke called Thos. No idea what he thinks he's got to do with this, but
I was just passing through.
Welcome to my studio and to Musical Talk, and how nice of you to take time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Shall I just sit on one of these gold chairs that you've got?
Yes, would you mind? Thank you. And hang on, I'm just going to ring the butler for some tea. We have been talking previously about Allegro, which is a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, like the operas. You know, I like to try and pronounce it in the original, and we got a certain way through talking about it.
Do you like Ida then?
That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. My mother once got Princess Ida, the Gilbert and Sullivan, mixed up with Aida. She thought it was Princess Aida, and wondered if I was interested in seeing it.
I think we'd all be interested in seeing that.
Presumably I don't know, but the Anvil chorus is a little bit Sullivan-esque. Anyway, we digress immediately. We must return to Allegro by Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Translation, Allegro.
Allegro. Word meaning fast, as we all know, and it really is a title that belongs to the second act of the musical. We previously discussed the differences between those two acts, and the song itself refers to city life, which is really the topic of the second half of the musical entirely. Now, interesting that they should make that choice, because we were talking earlier about the fact that in some ways it's two musicals. The first half, a cosy Rodgers and Hammerstein-y sort of an affair.
As you'd expect.
As you'd expect from Rodgers and Hammerstein. But interestingly, the second half, despite being by Rodgers and Hammerstein, much more the kind of thing that audiences of Rodgers and Hart would have been accustomed to. Now, I know nothing of Rodgers and Hart, so this is the point at which I hand over to you to suggest what is Hart-esque or whatever you call it, about this second half in particular.
Well, we're going to be retreading old ground in a little way here, because Richard Rodgers' career is dissected perfectly by his two principal collaborators in terms of lyricists.
Bisected, surely.
Or homosected in the case of Larry Hart, because he was a very sad,
Are
bitter,
you a keen homosexist?
Don't get the chance often enough.
Right, well anyway, moving on.
Lawrence Hart, I think, is a great man. Stephen Sondheim really doesn't like Lawrence Hart.
No.
Thinks him as shoddy. But it's often been described, fairly or unfairly, I wouldn't like to say, that Sondheim is also a bit jealous of the fact that Hart could just sort of rock up, throw away these tremendously sophisticated, clever, internally rhymed lyrics, and then rock away again.
Rock away again to the bar.
Yeah, essentially. That is because he was a self-loathing gay man, as I said. And a very sad life, very sad life. But a genuine talent, and much loved still as a great lyricist. And I
What would someone like me know of Rodgers and Hart?
Blue Moon is one of their more romantic-y numbers, actually. Mountain Greenery,
yes.
The Lady is a Tramp.
Yes.
His funniest lyric is the one he wrote on his deathbed. It's called "To Keep My Love Alive,"
right?
Which is from the Connecticut, a Connecticut Yankee in the Court of King Arthur.
Yeah.
It's actually she's the villain of the piece, but she says that she's always been true to her many husbands, and when they begin to tire her, she murders them rather than divorces them. So that keeps her sort of true to them. And it's a beautiful catalogue song, and it goes on and on, because he wrote verse after verse on his deathbed of these hilarious characteristics by which he murdered them. So is it Sir Thomas had a harp, I cussed the thing, one night I crowned him with it just to bust the thing, and now he plays where harps are just the thing. I mean, that's nice. Good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, and it's full of that kind of stuff.
That's the sort of thing that Hart is famous for, really.
Yeah, exactly. And with Richard Rodgers...
Why is he different to Cole Porter in that respect? I mean, to me, that sounds like there's a slightly bitterer edge to the way that, just taking that little example.
Well, that's an observation that has been made, because a lot of his songs have a lot more longing in them. When he's writing the love songs, because he doesn't love himself, and he's full of self-loathing, there's that characteristic somehow imbues itself into a lot of his lyrics. But he's also, on the flip side, a very witty man. I mean, Cole Porter is a good example, though, because he's another gay
clever
man.
rhymer, yes.
Although comfortably secure. I mean, Lawrence Hart comes up, and Cole Porter was up, as it were, in terms of social...
He's the top.
Yeah, very good, yeah. But he brings out something more youthful and bouncy and vivacious, I think, in Richard Rodgers, which is why they're the perfect pair, and they are a good urban set of writers in the 20s and 30s and early 40s. And so if you were going to see a Rodgers and Hart show, you'd expect something brittle, funny...
Set in the city.
Set in the city, almost entirely, yes. Absolutely. Sometimes historically. I mean, By Jupiter is set in sort of a figurative place with old gods in it and things like that. Right. But, essentially you're looking at a modern life writ large in that environment, if you like. Rodgers and Hammerstein, I mean, the thing that's really obvious about Rodgers and Hammerstein is that Hammerstein is slower, or brings out the slowness in Rodgers. And so you get this sort of slow tempo stuff. Even the faster numbers, even in Allegro, they're not that fast. They're not. The fastest number in Allegro is a Rodgers and Hart number. It's the school dance set in the 20s at the college that Joe goes to, which is Mounting Greenery, which is one of the first big hits for Rodgers and Hart. And you can see why Rodgers picked it. He picked it because it was the thing he was writing at that time, and it's exactly what people were listening to. So it's not a pastiche. It is a genuine piece of music from that period by him. So
also,
that's the difference.
Whereas Hammerstein, I mean, his innovation is supposed to be that the songs are interpolated and serve the drama better. They're not necessarily standalone numbers.
They're not standards.
Even though of course nowadays they are standards.
Yeah.
But this was a progression in musical theatre, and that Hart belongs, and when Rodgers is with him, they belong perhaps more in Tin Pan Alley. And they do write standards, and the songs begin and end, and may or may not contribute to the drama.
Model as well. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true, which is why they've been picked up by the jazz community and are still performed so often.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason, that they are easy
taxis
to
arrived, by the way.
It's going very fast.
Yeah.
As Eric Morecambe used to say, you won't sell any ice creams at that speed, will
No.
you? So. Yes, and also Oscar Hammerstein and Rodgers with him at that stage are also more interested in the book of the piece they're performing. You go and see Connecticut Yankee, although it's based on a Twain book, it's a comedy.
Yeah.
It's not going to tell you much about the human condition, whereas Oklahoma pretends that it does. Whether it does is another matter.
Well, indeed.
And of course, Hammerstein had done it already with Showboat. The book is so important to a Hammerstein story.
So, in what way is the second half of Allegro a Rodgers and Hart mini musical?
First, it's urban, and but it's not quite as simple as that. It's Hart. It's more hearty. It is not a Hart musical in the sense that I think you can still feel it's a 40s piece and not a 20s piece or a 30s piece. Not just from the costumes, but it's an urban environment. I mean, funnily enough, the costumes do set it in place, because actually there's not much change in the country costumes in Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein from 1905,
or indeed in real life.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Well, exactly. Dungarees were fashionable all throughout that century.
Exactly.
Whereas actually, we're wearing sort of zoot suits in Allegro, in the big shoulders, big lapels, stripes.
Yes.
It's the world of guys and dolls, actually.
Yes.
That's how it looks. And the women are quite smart, and they're wearing pearls, and it's the smart set anyway. So they're so that looks immensely urban, and that gives you a Hart feel, because that's the kind of musical. So it looks like a Hart musical. I'm not sure it sounds so much like a Hart musical. There are some Hartish moments in the song Allegro, which we'll talk and analyse about in a minute, which then starts where our heroes are spoofing or satirising what they see as the weakness and failure and emptiness of the upper set in a city. It then moves into a ballet where those very people who are the chorus, dressed to the nines in their zoot suits, do this angular dance and constantly moving, and it's jitter, jitter, jitter. It's not a jitterbug, but it is constantly moving like a jitterbug. That song also features another Rodgers and Hart song in it, which is Johnny One Note.
Oh yeah.
Which is about only being able to... Johnny could only sing one note, and the note he sang was this. Ah! Or whatever.
Yes.
And then the whole song is about that. And the very end of the song is how his note can hold its own against any other note. Ships' whistles, schools' whistles, factory whistles, all of them bow to his fame, as it were.
Yes.
And it's crescendo, even though it's a one-note crescendo almost, in that. That is quoted several times throughout the ballet of Allegro. And I think if you then compare it to the lyrics of Allegro, which is all about the big notes and ignoring all the subtleties, you get to see why Rodgers has chosen to put Johnny One Note in there, because it fits thematically, lyrically, i.e. using Hart's lyrics into what Joe and his friends are trying to say about the society.
Brisk, lively, merry and bright, Allegro. Same tempo, morning and night. Don't stop whatever you do. Do something dizzy and new. Keep up the hullabaloo. Yeah, I mean, it's incessancy, I suppose.
Fun enough, taking you back to something we said last week, there's also that business about what the definition of Allegro actually is.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to read that bit about the lack of counterpoint.
Yeah, so it says, Allegro, a musician would so describe the speed of it, the clash and competition of counterpoint, the need of it. We cannot prove the need of it. We know no other way of living out a day. Our music must be galloping and gay. Yeah,
It's using the tropes of Rodgers and Hart's score to underline the point that Hammerstein is making about its emptiness.
Right.
So you've got two direct Rodgers and Hart, and the thing people will say, well, hang on a minute, it's entirely appropriate that Richard Rodgers should be using his own music in his own musical, even if it's recycled. But it is the meaning that's imbued by Hart's lyrics that give those two. When you hear Mountain Greenery, you hear the words Mountain Greenery rather than the melody. You're thinking Lawrence Hart's words, and particularly with Johnny One Note, when Rodgers is putting that into the ballet for Allegro, you are hearing what Johnny One Note is about as a song, and that's down to Larry Hart and not down to Richard Rodgers. And then, of course, we've got the big one, which is The Gentleman is a Dope.
Yes. Now,
The Gentleman is a Dope follows the more traditional pattern of an A-A-B-A song.
Yeah.
It's also wistful. It's got a touch of... it's not quite self-loathing, but there is this I can't attain this love I want, which is a very Hartian concept. And it's done. I mean, it's a beautiful song. It's the nurse going home after that horrible, horrible day. So her boss has gone to the ball, as it were, with his wife. She's walking home. It's starting to rain.
Yes.
And indeed, the music. This is where Richard Rodgers is a genius, by the way. I think for all his faults, he's amazing. The verse starts with this piece of music. Goes dum 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 dum. The boss gets on my nerves. Yep. I've got a good mind to quit, etc., etc. That dum 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 is when the rain is starting.
Yeah.
It represents rain coming down into her life figuratively as well as accurately.
Yes.
And she's looking for a taxi and she can't find one, so she's bumbling around the streets in the rain, so having a miserable time after a horrible day at work, in love with a man who she thinks doesn't love her, or maybe doesn't realise he does love her, or doesn't at the moment realise anything really. And she's thinking about, I've come to the end of my tether. It's an end of my tether song, and an end of my tether song is very much a Hart kind of concept than it is more of a Hammersteinian one, I think. I think it's a beautiful song, and as I say, it's one of the songs from the Rodgers and Hammerstein. The point you're making, not that many, they are standards, but they haven't all made it into the jazz world. They aren't regularly sung by chanteuzis. But
no, indeed.
But The Gentleman is a Dope is one that does, and indeed that's how I stumbled across it first of all.
Yeah,
Ella Fitzgerald covered it.
Well, it's also the exclamation mark at the end of quite a long sequence of dramatic action that then we move into a new section, basically. So,
I should say that it's also covered. One of the best versions of it is by the late Diana Dawes in her one and only singing album, which is called Swinging Doors, which is worth the price of admission anyway.
It was a sliding doors. I don't know what
that's when she fell over in the recording booth. So those are the concepts that are Hartian, but I wouldn't say that Act 2 is in itself more Rodgers and Hart. I would say it has more Rodgers and Hart in it than any other Hammerstein musical with Rodgers, but it is not a Hartian one. I think it's still absolutely imbued with Hammersteinian concepts. Which brings me on to my question for you then.
Yeah.
Which act do you personally like best?
Of Allegro, I feel a slightly greater fond... Actually, I don't know, we've been talking about it now, and I probably would have said the first act, actually, when we were starting. But I must admit, talking so extensively about the second act has reminded me of the things I liked about that. So it's finely balanced. But the first act, I think I slightly prefer, just because of the nostalgic aspect of it. And as I say, this whole sort of Thornton Wilder feel it's got. In terms of numbers, though... I don't know. I like Allegro, and I like One Foot, Other Foot, and what else do I really like? I think I suppose quite a fair amount of the more romantic songs getting on towards the end of the first act, and the college scenes are pretty good. So I don't know. Maybe just the first act, just.
I will accept that the first act is better in the sense that it's more coherent.
Yeah.
But I actually prefer the second act, and funny enough, it's because of its Hart overtones, not just musically and lyrically, but I mean, Act 2 seems to be more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And that's what draws me. The problem with that one is I don't relate to the Hammersteinian ideal of the countryside in America.
Home and hearth and all that.
Motherhood and apple pie. I'm not that interested in that. It doesn't speak to me. And I have no affection for it. In fact, quite the reverse. So, those things don't interest me. The story is a story. It coheres perfectly, but it's very, very linear. There's not much going on, particularly for Joe. Joe just goes from each step of growing up.
Literally.
Other people do some things around him.
Yes.
But we were talking about this earlier, this sort of siphonous that he has.
Yeah.
But it's a very linear from birth to wedding, essentially. and that's fine, but you don't feel there are any subplots. There's not much going on. Whereas Act 2, the appeal to me, I think, is the fact that actually, I mean, you could argue at one level it's a bit more soap opera-ish in the sense there's lots of little things going on. There are intrigues going on that you can see people jostling for position in the politics of the hospital. There's the question, the invisible people at the hospital we've already touched upon, so the hospital's doing more than you see. So you're being invited to read a lot more into the story than's being shown to you as well, which I don't think you get in Act 1.
Who do you like character-wise in the second act?
Now you're asking, aren't you?
Well, this is.
Well, I love the nurse. I think the nurse is entirely
brilliant. She is the sort of
from-
anchor character of that act, isn't
and
she?
beautifully performed the day we saw her.
I certainly.
Oh, and I should say that people who are interested in this should go along to YouTube, where, as part of the promotional material for the show, although it's now finished, it's still there. It was when I was checking this morning. That the tremendous actress who played the nurse,
It was called Katie Bernstein.
she's singing "The Gentleman Is a Dope" in character. And it includes the call for a taxi at the end as well, and even down to the "damn it, I'll walk" kind of sort of tagline, which you don't get in the standard. You know, Ella Fitzgerald doesn't finish that way,
which is a shame, I think.
It is indeed. But that's a beautiful thing. So, in answer to your question, I think the nurse is by the best character. She's the best character, speech marks morally. She's got the best song.
Yeah, she's the architect of the outcome of that act.
Yeah, she's the good solution, actually, isn't she?
Yeah, she proves that you can go to the big city and still retain all of your
be from the big
your
city.
moxie, or be from which presumably she is.
Who do you like in Act 2? Who do you like in Act 1?
It has to be in Act 2. It has to be her. I think in Act 1 it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are a set of characters who don't have many choices. And so, while certainly one sympathises with Joe, because Joe is very difficult not to sympathise with, he's
designed
a character so devoid of personality that it's very hard not to see things from his point of view. I think one is meant to be very sympathetic to the mother and certainly the father as you go through. And the father's an interesting absence in many ways, isn't he? I mean, he's very much there at the beginning and very present. But actually, it's the female characters that are significant in Joe's life and his grandmother and mother.
Well, Joe's life is certainly back in the country is a domestic life.
Yeah.
Forgive me, at that time, women are the mistresses of the domestic household.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's interesting because the whole point of the thing is that he wants to follow his father.
Yes.
And then
professionally
decides, and then takes another course.
Well, although even that's to follow his father, because Jenny then says, "I was just thinking, silly old me, if we took this job in the city, you'd be rich enough to give your father the £10,000 he needs to build his hospital."
Indeed, yes, yeah. But,
silly old me.
So I don't know. I suppose the father, in some ways, is the better character. I mean, obviously, he is sickeningly virtuous because he wants to stay down home and help his people, and also he's wiser, isn't he? Because obviously, as we discover, he didn't set up treasure for himself on Earth, and luckily he therefore didn't really get burned in the Wall Street crash because there was nothing to burn.
That's right. They end up living in his house, don't they? I mean, that's the irony. I think I rather like that conceptually.
Yeah. I think it's true. I think really it's a lot of the first act is about Joe's likability in the first half, and about his just delight in the world, and that he encounters, and his comparative lack of introspection almost.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say he has E-Day fix, because he's very easily swayed, I find, by other people, but once he's got to a conclusion, he generally sticks with it. I mean, he fell for his sweetheart, and they meet when they're 8 or something like that. Yeah. And he's pining for her all the way through until she's finally adulterous.
Yes.
There's in the second act when he reprises for the umpteenth time, "You Were Never Away." Yeah. It's introduced by him saying, "Even when we were back home in the country, when I was driving between the cases, between houses, I was always thinking of my sweetheart."
Yes, yes.
So he's still sort of winsomely
as Cary Grant once had it.
Yeah.
Sweetheart. Yeah.
I must say, actually, as well, I mean, I much prefer Act 2, taking us back to that question. I remember getting to the interval at the end of Act 1, and I was thinking in my head, that has put the wince into winsome. So but that's because of my personal prejudice against sort of gentle living in
generally
innocent naivete, I suppose.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think I suppose you have had the college sequence by then, which does take you into slightly less, soupy territory.
Well, one assumes that the university is in a city of some variety.
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. Yes, of course, they don't cover that particularly. So the first act is, I think, nicer in perhaps heavy quotation marks, and the second half is certainly more sort of hard bitten. But
sophisticated, I think.
Yeah, more sophisticated.
That's not to say
a little bit more
mechanical.
mechanical.
Yeah.
A little bit more mechanical as well.
Yes, that's fair.
Yeah.
You don't feel that Hammerstein is writing in his comfort zone?
No, that's perhaps true. Actually, yeah, that is perhaps true. I think perhaps again, it is moralistic. The musical overall is moralistic, and there's no sort of getting away from that. And again, that's certainly a familiar story with the Hammerstein. Yeah. You've got your South Pacifics, and you've got to be carefully taught, and all those sorts of things. And he is sort of it is quite didactic, but I think less troublingly so perhaps in this one than in some of the other musicals. Particularly Oklahoma, where effectively there's a little bit of a kangaroo court goes on at the end, isn't there? Where they sort of deal out a bit of arguably rather rough justice to a man with a mental health problem.
Yes.
So I think it's interesting that this doesn't quite doesn't quite lecture quite so hard.
Yeah.
Even though obviously he returns to his roots.
Although actually, at the end of the day, apart from having an affair.
Yeah.
No one actually does anything bad in this. People are grey or amoral,
well, I think that's
or
the point
venal or empty, but no one's bad.
That's precisely the point. I mean, that's exactly what it's meant to show you, how good people do unwise but comprehensible things. It's quite interesting in as much as obviously I wasn't around at the time, but there'd just been this war, and there'd just been this whole sort of era in which people who were just trying to do their best for themselves, and I mean in America really because of the Depression, and that it does depict sort of a little bit of the pressures that people were under. I think it's why it's perhaps been quite a good moment to revive the show, because
austerity.
In comes the Depression, in comes the austerity. People make moral compromises. They have to. I mean, the more extreme versions of that, obviously in Germany and what was going on there. But even for an American audience, you just had the Dust Bowl, and and people really had to, do what they needed to
survive, to put bread on the table.
Exactly. Yeah. To put food on their families, as George W. Bush once correctly said it. Yes.
Did he rather splendidly?
I do believe he did. Yeah.
He's got some sauce.
Indeed, yes.
Something we've not discussed, and it's a conceptual thing. It's the use of the Greek chorus in this. Is that successful?
I like it. Again, because it's a sort of trope of epic theatre, and to have a chorus and to have a bit of didactic, sideline, as it were. Yeah. It's used a bit heavy-handedly here, I think you could argue. But that's nothing particularly new about Greek choruses. I think it's part of the fabric of the thing, and if it draws the moral out just a little bit too heavily at times, then there you go.
I've heard it argued that one of the great innovations of this is the use of the final combination of a chorus from a musical, a standard object.
Yeah.
Clear in Gilbert and Sullivan, all the way through, and well before that as well, and still going strong in some places, with the Greek chorus of ancient Greek drama. And having therefore a chorus in a musical who works both as a chorus, i.e. characters in the piece, as we see in Allegro, where the song is being sung about them, as opposed to, but also not being in the situation we're observing, but observing it as it were, as we are, and commenting on it, as in one of the reprises of You Were Never Away. What that has the unusual effect of, however, is that you get this intimate courting scene between Joe and Jenny in Act 1, and 28 people standing around them singing about it.
Well, isn't the intent and the effect of that to sort of, it's about universalisation. In other words, if you weren't there in the thing, here are some people explaining how it relates to you. The whole
here's what you're getting, everyone.
Yes, here's what's in it for you. Why you should pay attention at this point. So I think that is, but that's a conventional function of a chorus, and I think I suppose, and this is kind of interesting because you get a little bit of this effect. Again, we've talked often about Thornton Wilder and Our Town in this. This sort of idea of collective narration, which is also a feature of Under Milkwood, which I also mentioned earlier, gives you this notion of a community being a character in the thing. And it's interesting that when you get to the second half, that is slightly harder to square with the sort of dramaturgy of the scenario that you've got.
Well, there's less
in the
community,
first
isn't there?
Exactly. In the first half, it's all set in one town. It makes sense for the townsfolk to be the sort of, the conscience, the inner life, the voice, as it were, of the people.
Well, it is.
But
the
in the
people who
second
make
half,
morality
in the second
anyway.
half, who are they? Are they still those sort of townsfolk, or are they the voice of the city, or are they just sort of, just all for us? Slightly interesting, given that they're so firmly set up as the townsfolk in the first half. It does make a slightly. You have to make a bit of a transition.
That's true, actually. It's good. Forgive me. I mean, champion isn't quite the word, but they are the champions of their own environment in Act 1. And there are no champions in Act 2.
No.
Or such champions as there are in Act 2 are the individuals.
That's right. I mean, either they're not the voice of the except in the song Allegro, which is ironic. They sort of go around sort of hymning the wonders of life at speed.
Yeah.
But
or indeed
but
on
they
it.
don't mean it. Like the author doesn't mean it, and therefore they don't mean it. So I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting. I think in some ways they do retain some status as the townsfolk of from the original town.
So, is Allegro a tragedy or not?
It's not. Well, I mean, in a very conventional sense, it's not. No, but what do we draw from it in terms of its worldview? I think is a really interesting question, because ultimately it's optimistic. The conclusion is that he follows his conscience, he follows his heart, he is able to go to a place, he's able to live a meaningful life having strayed from the path, like Dante halfway through this path of life. So I think it's optimistic in that sense. It's not all optimistic in this way that other Rodgers and Hammersteins can be. He doesn't go off into the sunset exactly. There isn't a clarity about what his marital arrangement's going to be going forward from this day. Not everything is settled at the point, so it's hopeful. There is a type of story structure called the happy loser, and it perhaps falls into that. And interestingly, it's the same ending as you get in Pippin by Stephen Schwartz,
I've seen
which
that.
is also an everyman story, and highly allegorical and very, and so I think and clearly follows on from this type of thing.
Sidestep. I researched the real Pippin after I saw Pippin the musical, and do you know how the real Pippin dies?
No.
He's exiled by his father to a monastery, and he dies of plague.
Marvellous.
They don't put that in the musical, do they?
But that ends famously with "How do you feel?" Happy but trapped, sort of dead but
Covered in
and
buboes.
But I think maybe it's that. It's the happy loser story. In other words, he experiences material gain and progress in the world, but also finally comes to an estimation of it as as not necessarily worth as much as he originally thought.
I think you can argue
and he's content with that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a contented ending, but I observe it as a redemptive tragedy, in the sense that he does inadvertently sell his soul. It's the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of concept. But he then finds his integrity again, and that is the redemptive element of it. He wanders off into the sunset of his home life with his busy mate and his potential future wife, basically.
Yes, exactly.
So the last sort of area I'd like to discuss on Allegro, I think, is its legacy.
Right.
What is the legacy of Allegro, do you think?
Well, so we talked about this on a previous occasion, and you mentioned, I think, rightly, Company by Sondheim. Obviously, Sondheim, again, as we said earlier, was involved in the first production.
There.
He was there. He was watching how it was done. He was watching how the things were put together. So, as a protege of Hammerstein, Sondheim may well be an outcome of this. And this is the least un-Sondheim-like of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals.
That's a beautiful sentence, but I agree with it. Yes.
I was going for the German sort of sentence construction, method. Other than, I suppose, Do I Hear a Waltz, which of course isn't Hammerstein.
A direct
Rodgers
number with him, but yeah.
Indeed. But so I suppose, in that sense, the staging. I mean, Sondheim, we have to be a bit careful, because a lot of where Sondheim has collaborated has been with people like Harold Prince and stuff like that, who have to a certain extent defined the stagecraft and defined the the things that you see in this that are a little bit similar in Company.
Prince quotes Allegro as one of his
there you
formative
go,
influences.
Then. So then we do have a legacy
Yes.
from it, I suppose. Yes, it wasn't just someone who sat there in the audience every night and watched it, was it?
This is why it's
I
a
guess
failure, everyone. I got free tickets.
Interesting. I don't know if we have a legacy from the fact that there was a female director and indeed a combined director choreographer. I don't know where we are in the relation to Jerome Robbins here. But
Well, he's going to work with Sondheim later, isn't he?
Yeah.
On West Side Story.
So I don't know if as I understand it, and this is not my area, but as you rightly said, it was Agnes de Mille who had been the choreographer on previous musicals and then stepped up into
That's
the
right.
director role combined here. And my understanding was that was pretty much unprecedented. Like it just
I believe.
hadn't been done at that point. But there you have Jerome Robbins with West Side Story 10 years later or thereabouts, slightly under. And
there you are.
making an absolute perfection of it.
Yeah.
So
It came right.
So perhaps it did tread a little bit of ground for that without being too close to it. I don't know. What do you think? The legacies.
Well, I'm actually going to be a bit more specific in terms of the shows. When you read the analysis online, people always say Company is the sequel to Allegro, at least thematically.
Right.
In the sense you've got this 30-something cipher character around which other people are wanting him to do things. And he's looking back and failed relationships. There's a whole concept musical, once again, if you want to use that. Company is an exploration of what it is to be married or not married, or in a relationship or not in a relationship. And I see all that, but it seems to me that there is another Sondheim which feels much more like Allegro than Company. And that's Merrily We Roll Along.
Oh, yeah.
Because, first of all, it takes place over 30 years, which is almost exactly the spot.
Indeed,
It just
yes.
happens to be going backwards. And the Frank character is... Well, he actually says in Merrily We Roll Along, he has some line, doesn't he, about the fact the biggest mistake he's made in his life is always saying yes when he meant no, i.e. being persuaded by other people to do things.
Yes.
Which is exactly what happens to Joe
Yes.
Taylor Jr. here.
Yes. Yes.
And he's we see them at the end, i.e. their youth, as these innocents who are trying to do, in their case, write musicals for the benefit of the public. But there is a question about not selling out, so there's this integrity element even there.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you've actually got the direct lifts, if you like. The Blob from Merrily We Roll Along is the Yatatata sequence from the second act of Allegro, where it's almost exactly the same. If you look at the lyrics.
Yes, so I suppose the words include, it begins with people just shouting out these big non sequiturs. Broccoli, hogwash, boulderdash, bologna, trash. Well, I suppose they're not non sequiturs technically.
But they're put down to the, basically these are the responses to their facile arguments, isn't it? You're talking broccoli, bologna.
Busy, I'm busy as a bee. I start the day at 1:30. When I'm finished phoning, it's time to dress for tea. Nothing we have to do gets done. Oh.
But it's that baloney stuff that, in Merrily We Roll Along, it's...
You're not serious.
Yeah, exactly. Does that not feel
it's the
almost
greatest,
the same
best,
thing?
it's the greatest, it's the, etc.
I call them the blob.
Yeah.
And that runs its way all the way through Merrily. You see it at Frank's party at the beginning of the piece when he's a successful filmmaker.
Yes.
All the way through to the blob when they're introduced to the blob, the movers and shakers
Indeed,
of the upper set
the most important
in society
people of the most
by
important
Gussie.
city in the most important country, yeah.
In the you-know-what.
Yes.
And she's not talking through her you-know-what in that. So, in some senses, that is a direct borrow. So I think Frank can be seen as a version of Joe.
Yep.
I think that the apart from the going backwards thing, there are so many thematic and actual borrows from Allegro.
Merrily We Roll Along sort of has its cake and eats it in the sense that, of course, that because you end in a happy and optimistic place, but the only way you can get there is to go backwards in time instead of forwards. The Allegro, of course, circles around in time.
Yes.
And he moves forward into moral
Past is
danger
new.
and all of it, but finally he also is able to move forward into a return to youthful optimism. Sondheim doesn't believe in it.
No. Merrily is a much more sophisticated piece.
Yeah.
It's also a much more downbeat piece.
Yeah.
But it's also the one that, in its own way, feels more believable. Oddly.
Yeah.
And if there is one other thematic connection with it. It was a failure.
Yes.
Although I think we should be very careful. Once again, Sondheim says of Allegro it wasn't a failure. And at one level it wasn't, because it didn't close early. It ran for 3 years or something like that. Or what it did was it had such a good pre-purchase ticket sale.
Yeah.
And apparently made something like 10 million in advance ticket sales. And apparently 1 million was considered an amazing amount. So it just knocked the spots off of everything. And because of that, the theatre was filled every night, sold out for years on end, i.e. 2 or 3 years, but then no one else came.
Yeah.
And indeed, the reviews were not universally bad. You know, some of the reviews say they are fantastic, but some of the reviews say, well, this isn't very good, or how dare Rodgers and Hammerstein say how much they despise the life they've recently succeeded in, i.e. the New York theatre life, essentially. So you've got, it's 50-50. So Sondheim says it's not a failure, it is a disappointment.
When do we get Singing in the Rain, by the way?
Now that's a good example. That's a good question. That's a 50s thing, but I couldn't tell you more.
Right, so we're a little bit late. Singing in the Rain was after this.
Yes.
And quite successfully does a very different story, but in a sense, not entirely, because like it's about the compromises of making your way in the world and, and having a certain amount to conceal. But obviously exuberantly hymns all of the milieu that it's set in Hollywood and so on, So.
And all the power's in the hands of men as well.
Oh, well, yeah, go figure.
Yeah. Well,
could one write a modern equivalent of this show? I mean, talking of legacies, and what would it centre on? I mean, are the experiences it outlines still pretty much universal? It seems to me that by and large they are. You might not have necessarily been quite so focused on a man's perspective, which I think is perhaps a thing that dates it. But nowadays we've had our Wall Street crash again. We've got a lot of people who are experiencing this whole thing of starting in suburbia or the obscure parts of the world, trying to make their way in these difficult parts. I mean, all the millennials, trying to get into the cities and things. I mean, they're getting out of the cities in unprecedented numbers. Because of the sort of environment financially and morally, and presumably therefore morally, it becomes. So I don't know. I think it's kind of very timely that they revived it at this time, and I think maybe somebody could fairly easily write another show that was structured in the same way, that deals with the same sort of quandaries.
I've just been, however, forgive me, everything you say there is interesting, and I'd like to see how they would do it. Because you would have to lay on a much greater pattern of sophistication. Yeah. But the back of my mind has been ticking over about the how Sondheim also reversed the whole concept in Into the Woods, because actually, that is a village. It's an agrarian environment.
Oh yes.
The sophisticates, such as they are the palace,
which we never see.
No, we don't. We hear about, but we don't see. But the witch, if you like, is also a sophisticated character. Yeah. And she admonishes the baker and his wife for trying to bend the rules to get what they want.
Yes.
So it is the sophisticate who teaches the lesson to the bumpkins, if you like, for want of a better phrase, which is the reverse story. But
well, she's there to sort of as a moral irritant. She's there to sort of point out that the cosy, comforting notions of what's moral are
just a little bent.
Are rather self-serving, in fact.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's possibly one for another time. I'd like to see. I was glad to see it revived. I thought it was revived extremely well as well in this particular production, and amazingly sung and really well played. But I think it was a timely choice. I think we've had certain musicals that come back at the right times, and so much that's post-Depression era and that deals with the Depression is suddenly newly relevant, and I think that's a great thing.
Well, on the night we saw it, I remember you unusually liked it more than I did.
Yeah, and I don't like Rodgers and Hammerstein as a rule.
No, nor do I. But I that's not to say I didn't like it. But I tell you what I've really liked about it, and it's one of those shows, and these are the shows I like the best, where you leave the theatre but the show stays with you. And I've been thinking about it since. And here we are today, having discussed it at quite some length, and I still feel there's meat on the bone, as it were. So that'll be an Allegro of meat. Allegro of lamb. I can't do
that's
it.
Abysmal.
That's painful, isn't it? Yeah,
yes.
I'm actually I'm stunned.
Yes.
Make myself speechless.
Yes, indeed. Still, we are going to have to leave that little bit of meat on the bone, I'm afraid, because there's.
I've got one foot in the gravy, if that's any help.
That's right. There's always much more to discuss, but one thing I'm going to say is that having bought after we saw it the original album, the original cast album, which is actually really only a fairly fragmentary selection of bits and bobs from the show, There was, of course, in 2006, going out of date, a full cast recording finally made. It wasn't actually based on production, was it? It was just they did a recording.
Includes a lot of dialogue.
And highly recommend that to anybody who's interested in whether you like Rodgers and Hammerstein or not. You might like this.
Yes, I agree with that. As people know, I don't like Rodgers and Hammerstein as a rule, but I would recommend Allegro. It's a good playground. And of course, that album features the late Marnie Nixon, so always worthwhile hearing her playing the grandma.
Marvellous. So, Thos, thank you very much for coming into my studio and for eating my biscuits and for drinking my tea. You may go now. Thank you so much. You're dismissed.
Thank you, sir. I'll just walk backwards through the door, bowing.
Yes, and to those of you who'd like to join me another time, well, you probably won't be able to, as I only make very occasional appearances on the show. But
it's usually when you're addressing the proletariat from your dictator's balcony.
I believe that's correct. Yes, yeah. Other things. I'm taken elsewhere by my other duties. In the meantime, you're all dismissed as well. But thank you very much for joining us on Musical Talk this week.
This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood, and was edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2017. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. It starts with the word broccoli.
There we are.
Rodgers and Hammerstein, I mean, the thing that's really obvious about Rodgers and Hammerstein is that Hammerstein is slower, or brings out the slowness in Rodgers. I'll say that again. Brings out the slowness in Rodgers. And
but say that again, that's just like a sort of advertising slogan, isn't it?
Brings out
Bert's custard brings out the slowness in Rodgers.
And we all want a nice slow Rodgers. Right, moving on.